lived there. I know that culture. We Americans and those, because of those conquistadors and things like that that brought all the Eastern religions, I say Eastern, from Europe over into South America. Good point. All right, so does this make sense? You got everybody kind of caught up now as far as where I know the big, quick introduction, but many of you I know have been in this class. Some of you are new, and so I wanted to give you this introduction, remind you of some of these things before we begin looking at this passage itself. Now, here's another timeline that I just happened to find. It's just I like visual things, and so what we have is this word where Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount. So you can see that it's marked right there, and as you move forward in the timeline, the next one is where we're going to go to right now, and that is that Jesus heals a centurion's servant. And so Matthew chapter 8. Well, I figured if I had pretty pictures, Joey, it would be more, it'd be more, I don't know, attractive or something. It would help you a little bit. It worked because you said, look at all the pretty pictures. Okay, so Matthew chapter 8. Let's read verses 5 through 13. Now, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found. Over to Luke chapter 7. Now pay attention to the things that we just read. Hopefully you got that fresh in your mind. And I want you to think about what you just read. And even if you have to, take your finger and go back and forth between the two passages. But now go over to Luke chapter 7. And we're going to read the same account. But what you're going to see is there are some differences. And this is why we like doing this chronological study in order to help us see the picture more clearly. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Notice the differences. Now, when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum, and a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. And when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, preaching with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was worthy, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well who had been sick. Very interesting. Now, what are some of the things that you notice? Because if I'm reading this, I'm seeing I'm going to go ahead and do this, contradiction. I'm seeing some contradictions here. Did you notice any differences? What do you notice in Matthew that's different in Luke? Very good. The word servant. What was that? The elders. Okay. Matthew, who came to Jesus? According to Matthew, who came to Jesus? The centurion. The centurion himself came to Jesus. Here in Luke, we see what? We see that he sent Jews. He sent elders. Not only that, but then a little while later, he even says, that's why I didn't come myself. He sends other people and even says, I didn't come myself. Okay, Matthew, you just told me that this centurion came to see Jesus, and then over here I've got Luke telling me that the centurion said, I'm not even worthy to come to you. Man, looky there. Can't trust the Bible. We got a contradiction here. Yes or no? Very good. I want to hear you say that every time. There are no contradictions in the Bible. There are no contradictions in the Bible. Okay, so you can just go ahead and mark that down. What is a contradiction? Somebody give me an example of an actual contradiction. Okay. That would be one. That would be a good contradiction. Joey says he likes pretty pictures. All right. I say Joey said he does not like pretty pictures. All right. So let me back up here. Steve here says, Joey says he likes pretty pictures. Troy says, no, Joey said he does not like pretty pictures. You see, there's an absolute contrast there, an absolute contradiction. I am contradicting what Steve is saying. I'm saying what he's saying is not true. Now, think about that. That's what a contradiction is. Did Matthew contradict Luke, or did Luke contradict Matthew? Did either one of them say the centurion did not come? Did Matthew say that? Did Luke say the centurion did not come? He didn't say that either. All right, so here's how you reconcile that, if you will. That is, you simply look at this as supplementation. You just have more of the story. That's why we're doing this study, chronological study, because of things like this right here. It helps us see more clearly what the picture is. Now, let me ask you this question so you can understand what's happening with Matthew. Let's just say, Winston, I need to ask you a question, but I am busy, and so I say, Andrea, would you run over and ask Winston if we're going to go hunting day after tomorrow? Okay? She rolls over, she goes, asks Winston. Winston comes back. So later, Winston goes to Lola and says, hey, Troy wants to know if we can go hunting day after tomorrow. And Lola says, I never saw Troy come to you. So was it Troy that came to Winston? Yes. Andrea doesn't even like hunting, okay? So she's not going to go. And so it's Troy. All right, this is Troy. That's why he said, hey, Troy wants to know. Troy asked me. We use terminology like that. Troy asked me. That's exactly what you have here in Matthew. Looking back in Matthew now, keep your finger, because we're going to go back and forth. Keep your finger in Luke. In Matthew, it says a centurion came to him, pleading with him. All right, that's no different than Andrea going to Winston and saying Troy came to Winston asking him. All right? It's representative, especially in a man of authority. Now look in Luke's version. In Luke, it says, when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent elders pleading him. And notice they're using his voice. It says, it doesn't say the elders said on his behalf, which we know that's what happened, but we know that they were on his behalf speaking out. Does that make sense? Yes. Excellent. She said this would be a great example of Psalm 119, 160, that the sum of thy word is truth. So if you get both of those things together, I really hope I can impress upon you this idea, this understanding of supplementation. Because I'm telling you, that's a lot of people that don't understand the Bible, that want to find something wrong with the Bible. It's one of their favorite things to do is try to show contradictions of the Bible. And they'll use verses like this, or they'll use other verses trying to get you tripped up, and just smile and say, you need to go look at all of the Bible because it shows us very clearly. Okay, now what's interesting about this, looking in Luke's account, is that Luke says that this centurion sent these Jews, these elders. Now, what do we know about centurions? All right, Joey says century means 100. That's exactly right. A centurion is kind of like our What's that? In charge of 100. That's right. He's in charge of 100. A centurion is kind of like our, and I'm not a military man. I know we got a lot of military in the audience. Kind of like a lieutenant. Is that right? A lieutenant who's in charge of a certain amount of men. Am I saying that right? Anybody who knows military? A captain, okay. And so a captain or a lieutenant, he is one level, okay, of authority of a leader in the military. He is not the supreme leader or anything like that. He's just one. The centurion, as the name implies, is he's in charge of 100 men. Now, we see centurions in different parts of the New Testament. We see a centurion at the cross, Matthew 27:54, Mark 15, Luke 23. Remember that centurion who stood there and said, "Surely this was the Son of God." We see Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 and 11. We see Julius in Acts chapter 27. He's the one who took Paul down to Caesarea, taking him to Rome. And then we also see the centurion at Antonia Fortress. Now, what we see is typically the centurions are always nice guys, pretty nice guys, or reasonable. Let's put it that way. Maybe not nice, but they're reasonable. They treat people, they're painted in a good light. Was Cornelius a good person? All right. Same way with the centurion at the cross. Even right here, you have this man. Look what the Jews say about him. For he is worthy. One whom should you do this is worthy, for he loves our nation and built us a synagogue. Now, I don't know so much about loving the nation part. That's the words of the Jews saying this. But it'd be more like Cornelius. Cornelius loved who? God. All right, now he may not have understood God. You need to understand a little bit about Roman culture. Roman culture did they just have one God? They had one God, then they had a whole bunch of other gods too. They also had even emperor worship by the time we get close in Jesus' time and shortly thereafter. And so really it was no big deal to include God. That was just this God of heaven, this God of the Jews. They would include him in their culture, in their religious culture. Now, obviously, it had a bigger impact on people like Cornelius. And then eventually, I think that shows us complete separation from paganism into monotheism, which is what we are, believing in one God only. And then you have that. So they're all painted in a good light. The only one that maybe you could say is not that nice was the centurion at Antonia Fortress, because he was about to flog Paul, but he stopped, didn't he? Once he found out Paul was a Roman citizen, then he got worried. And I love that he writes a letter. "Oh, as soon as I found out, I sent him to you." So not exactly truthful there, but either way, they show this. Now, we know it's interesting that we have these Jews, and he sends them. You don't usually have Jews and Romans connecting like this. Preach it, brother, preach it. Sound like a Bible app there. Joey says that this centurion really must have loved him, because if to build him a synagogue, I mean, you're getting right at the heart of something very, very close to the Jews, and that's exactly right, Joey. Good observation. What is a synagogue? Does anybody know what a synagogue is? What was that? It's a worship. It's a Jewish church, as Joey says. It's just a building, okay? It's just a building where they would go and meet. Now, you need to understand, just so we can make sure everybody's on the same page, what is the center of Jewish religion at the time of Jesus? What is the center of Jewish religion? The temple. Where is the temple? Jerusalem. Okay, that's where everybody's supposed to go. Before the temple, it was the tabernacle. Excellent. So we went from the tabernacle to the temple, and that's where the center of Jewish religion was. But then the Jews sinned. They would not repent, and so God sends in the Assyrians first, and then the Babylonians to destroy the nation, to punish the nation. They're carried off to captivity. What happens to the temple? Destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple. Well, they no longer can do animal sacrifices because only there at the temple. They can no longer go to Jerusalem because that can only be done at the temple. All these things that have to be done at the temple, they can no longer do. But what they can still do is they can still pray, they can still read the Torah, and they can still gather and worship in some manner. They just can't do the animal sacrifices and the priestly things like that. So these synagogues start popping up all over the place. And mainly there it began in Babylon. And then from there, as the Jews were spread out across the Roman Empire, which is now the Roman Empire in Jesus' time, these synagogues pop up all over the place where they still go. Remember what I said earlier, that the Jews have to present themselves, Jewish men have to present themselves in Jerusalem 3 times a year. Well, the rest of the year, they continue to pray and read the Torah and continue to meet together to worship God. So it turns out that that is perfect and part of God's plan, because where does Paul and even Jesus and other people go to talk to people about the Messiah? The synagogues. And so that's where that comes from. That's actually going to be part of our sermon today. We're going to talk about worship today. So here you have this man who loves their nation, as they say, loves God. He probably even used his own money and his troops to build this synagogue. And so obviously he has endeared himself to the Jews. They come on his behalf to Jesus. And so here they are bringing the word to Jesus that he has this servant. Now, again, a man of authority, a man with power. Why is he so concerned about his servant? Typically, a slave or something like that is just a piece of property. Granted, you want your property, you want to take care of your property, but why is he so concerned about this one? It was dear to him. You know, in fact, the Greek, the way that they was a good relationship. Now, sometimes people would put themselves voluntarily to be a slave because they become indentured servants. That means that they owed a debt, they couldn't pay the debt, and so in order to work off that debt, they go and become a slave. That's how that term is used sometimes. Now, you have this servant who has become endeared to this centurion. He's worried about him. He's concerned about him. He hears of Jesus that he has this power to cure. So he sends these people, these elders, to go talk to him. And apparently they didn't say exactly what it was he wanted them to say. That's why you have there in the next part, it says in verse 6 of Luke chapter 7, that Jesus went with them, and he was already not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him. So apparently the Jews didn't do everything that the centurion wanted him to do. He said, no, I don't want him to come to my house. I want him just say the word, and he'll be healed. Now that shows us why this story is so important. And so the friends come, and he says, Lord, don't trouble yourself. I'm not worthy. So he understands. Again, it's an interesting contrast. Who is in charge? Who is the power in charge of the area where Jesus lives? The Romans, right? He's a Roman centurion. Does he have the power to basically cause anybody in the area to submit to him? Absolutely. Remember that part of the Roman, we've talked about this, part of the Roman law is that they can tell somebody to carry a load. They can see somebody, a citizen, there in Israel, and the Roman soldiers come along and say, hey, you carry this load, and they have to do it. So he has, and he even says it here, he has authority. But notice what he says to Jesus. I'm not worthy to come to you. This man of power, this man who has this ability to do these things, has the authority to do it. he lowers himself and exalts Jesus. That's an interesting paradox there, don't you think? So, he says, I'm not worthy that you should enter my roof. Therefore, just say the word, verse 7. Say the word, and my servant will be healed. It's also interesting, this passage, because we don't really have a precedent before of long-distance healing. Think about this. What does Jesus typically do in the miracles that we see of him healing people? He touches them. Remember the leper. In fact, in Matthew's version, go back to Matthew here. You're in Matthew chapter 8. Look back in verse 3 of chapter 8. What do we have here? This is one of the last things we talked about. It was Jesus healing a leper. All right, I say we talked about this. We talked about this quite a while back, and I'll make all this work here in just a minute as far as where it fits in. But he touched a leper. Is a Jew allowed to touch a leper?